look at India, still about 60% of our population is dependent on agriculture as a source of livelihood. And climate has a very direct impact on agriculture. Extreme weather events, droughts, flooding becoming more and more common. If we were able to bring down the AQI levels to the WHO standards, that sort of contributes to 5 years of life expectancy on average for people in India. People who were provided these monetary incentives walked more for, I think it was a 12-week-long study, and they walked more during those 12 weeks. But even after the incentives were discontinued, they continued that habit. They provided a deworming pill in the school, which the students had to consume. And what they found is that as a result of this school-based deworming, the students who were attending the school, they had a much lesser likelihood of falling sick due to worm infestation. Their attendance increased, their learning outcomes also increased.
So thanks a lot, Urvashi, for giving us your time, and I'm sure we'll get a lot to learn from this discussion. I'd like to start first on a very personal note that, from economics to a focus on public policy and development, how did that transition happen? You've studied development studies in Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So, just can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I wish I could give you an answer about how it was like a very well thought out and strategic plan. But honestly, I've kind of, I would say to some extent stumbled, but also found my way into this line of work through various experiences and interactions. So I actually in my 11th and 12th, I studied science.
Okay.
So I was a physics, chemistry, maths student, and at that time I wasn't very sure about what I wanted to do. But I think in those 2 years, I firstly realized that was not the direction I wanted to go. And really what I think was interesting to me was a little bit more on the social science side about sort of how people work, how can societies, economies function better to sort of deliver better outcomes for people at large. How do you reduce poverty? Sort of growing up in a country like India, obviously all these experiences are very front and center. And so I did my undergraduate studies in economics, but I think even when I went into economics, of course, there's, typically sort of two broad paths that people who are going into that field think about. There's like sort of the private sector, investment banking, MBA route that one might follow. But I think very early on when I started studying economics, what I realized is that even within economics, what was really driving me or what interested me was about sort of how economics could play a role in crafting like better public policies to improve outcomes, right? So I remember I did a course which is different from what I do at JPAL now on public finance, and that was like a really interesting course on sort of how taxes and policies that you create, financial incentives can all lead to different types of outcomes for education, the environment. And I think some of those courses I did, I was studying in the US at that time at a liberal arts college in Minnesota. But this college also had a really, I think like a focus on sort of social justice, improving outcomes for the most marginalized. And so that was always in the back of my mind. So in some ways, made sense to kind of go from not just doing economics overall, but really going further into development economics, development studies, which is when I went to TIS. But actually between my undergraduate studies and my master's, I also spent a year at Eklavya Foundation in Bhopal.
Right.
It's a grassroots NGO that works on education, in terms of improving pedagogy, learning materials, improving learning outcomes for students. And that was, I think, a really interesting experience for me to sort of realize that there's a lot of work that, motivated organizations are trying to do in this space. But like, how do you really know like what works or doesn't? What is the right approach? And then I did my master's, and soon after my master's, I ended up joining a development consulting firm that was trying to do impact evaluations, helping NGOs and other organizations make better decisions based on data, research, evidence. And I kind of just continued on that journey at JPAL. So I would say there was no one strategic thought, but I think various experiences, being in various places, sort of moved me in the direction of this field.
So we're going to talk about it in detail, but can you just briefly outline what does JPAL do? What do you do with JPAL?
So JPAL is short for Jameel Poverty Action Lab. This was a research center founded by 3 researchers from MIT, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, who received the Nobel Prize 6 years ago.
6 years
Some of
ago.
the COVID years just disappear,
yeah.
are a little bit of a blank. But yeah, 6 years ago. And they in particular pioneered an approach in development economics, which is the use of randomized evaluations or randomized control trials. So this is a sort of a slightly different approach to economics in the sense that there's a greater focus on sort of what does the data and empirical studies show you, and sort of testing hypotheses rigorously on the field rather than just going on the basis of theories. And so they started JPAL to really bring together a network of researchers who are sort of united in using this particular methodology to answer questions of what policies, what programs are effective in improving outcomes. Like not just focusing on like, did the policy get delivered, but if you're designing a new education curriculum, is it leading to better maths, better science, better English or Hindi learning for the students themselves? Because that's what you ultimately care about. And figuring that out in a rigorous way where you can say that the impact that you're seeing, the change that you're seeing is just because of this program. It's not because of other factors, other what we call confounding factors, right? If you are a kid in a school, you're learning a regular methodology, a new pedagogy is introduced, you might still have learned something in the course of that year, even without that new pedagogy. So how do you account for that natural increase that happens anyway? And this is the approach they've taken. It's of course, borrowing from the clinical trials approach, but you're doing these evaluations at a much different scale, in a much different setting. You're doing it out in the real world and trying to see, does this policy work or not? And so I think JPAL started with a network of about like 8 or so researchers when it was first established. And now we have close to 1,000 researchers, affiliated researchers, invited researchers. They're all academics, mostly economists at different universities across the world, including in India. And they use this methodology. And JPAL itself is the organization that, on the one hand, runs these evaluations. We test these programs through field evaluations. But we also have 2 other teams, the policy and training teams, in addition to the research team that runs the evaluations. So the policy team, which I'm a part of, our focus is then bridging that gap between this research and policy making. Like, how do you do research that speaks to policymakers' priorities? How do you match those 2 interests together? And then once an evaluation is completed, how do you ensure that it's not just a academic publication, but it's also informing programs, policies, government decision making, and so sort of bridging that gap between evidence and policy is sort of the role that this team plays.
Right. So, it's a very broad field to talk about. So let me narrow it down further. You primarily work in South Asia.
Yes.
The couple of things which are affecting people in day-to-day lives in South Asia. One obviously is poverty, unemployment. That's one part of it. But if you look at other natural factors, climate's changing very fast. There's the climate's changing. There's heat waves. There's pollution. There's everything. And since you go on the field, how do you see climate impacting mostly the vulnerable population in South Asia and specifically in India? How is climate impacting them?
Yeah, I think that's a great and a very topical question. I think it's sort of impacting all areas of our lives, right? So if you look at India, still about 60% of our population is dependent on agriculture as a source of livelihood. And climate has a very direct impact on agriculture. Extreme weather events, droughts, flooding, becoming more and more common, means that agriculture, which is already a very unpredictable livelihood, you have like seasons of abundant crop produce, seasons of not so great crop produce, prices vary, so it's already inherently a risky livelihood. On that you add climate change and some of these extreme weather events, and that can potentially lead to huge ramifications for the farmers themselves, so their livelihood is affected. They are, more vulnerable to sort of both economic and climate-related risks, right? So they are at the risk of losing their livelihoods. But at the same time, it's also a problem for the larger population, because if there is this vulnerability in agriculture, then that also reflects in food security. So, food crops could be affected. You could have years where there's huge price increases when a particular crop is low in production or affected by climate change.
Or
weather
vice
events.
versa, there's a high production rate and the costs go down.
Yes, and then the food crop is abundantly available, but then the farmers are affected in terms of the price that they earn. So I think that's one of the biggest ways in which climate affects, livelihoods, or is currently affecting India. I think another thing, we're sitting in Delhi in perhaps like one of the best months to be outdoors in Delhi, but for the coming few months, we might have another heat wave like we did last year, and that affects health, but it also affects productivity. I think every year when you have these extreme heat wave episodes, you hear of construction workers dying due to extreme heat stress, and that's something that's going to become more and more of an issue going forward. So I think one of the big questions that we are trying to sort of look at from a research perspective is, one, like how do you compensate people who are going to lose livelihoods because of heat waves? But then also, how do you protect people who are facing these? How do you, for instance, like use cool roofing technologies in schools so that students who are studying there are protected from these extreme heat waves? It's going to be sort of a regular reality for all of us. And then I think the last piece, though, of course, like, climate and the air pollution we see are not exactly the same, but interrelated. Yes. But air pollution in India, it's one of the biggest issues in, especially this Indo-Gangetic plain belt that we are a part of here in Delhi. And I think there's some studies that have been done which have shown that if we were able to bring down the AQI levels to the WHO standards, that sort of contributes to 5 years of life expectancy on average for people in India. And probably in Delhi it's more because we are exposed to it a lot more. But that's significant, right? It's affecting our health, it's affecting economic productivity and outcomes. And so I think those 3 things to me stand out as sort of the big climate and environment-related vulnerabilities we have.
So I have two follow-up questions on that. First, let me ask the first question. You've raised an important point about economic well-being and health. Okay, one, we talk about farmers in large. Which people don't recognize, but yes, I mean, and people associate it with males. That okay, males are doing farming, right?
Yeah.
But we tend to forget that there's a large chunk of females which are working in the fields which are not recognized that much.
Yeah.
Right? So how are they being affected by these things? Because you talk about agriculture as a whole.
Yeah.
While women are like, they're also they're getting hampered in that situation as well.
No, absolutely. And I think like you're absolutely right that if one is to imagine like what an Indian farmer looks like, typically we would imagine somebody who's male. But the fact is that whether you look at, agricultural land owners who are working on their own fields or agricultural labor, a large proportion of them are women. And especially if you're looking at, and it's both in sort of like migratory agricultural labor as well as people who are, in their own sort of locations. So, and there's many ways in which, climate might be affecting women in a more extreme way. Some of the jobs that they do on farms might be more labor intensive, and so they're more exposed to things like heat waves or other risks from climate change, right? So I didn't mention this point, but another impact of climate on health is sort of new diseases, new sorts of infectious diseases. So could they perhaps be more vulnerable to this given the kind of roles that they play on farms? Women who are migrating, if climate change continues to be a problem, previously arable land may not be. And what if they have to migrate to other locations? Overall, in India, actually, I think there's a study that has looked into this where when we think of migrants also, we don't think of women. Yeah. But actually, women migrate a lot, but when they get married. That's typically how that migration happens, right? So there are other concerns that come into play when women have to migrate around safety and vulnerability to that. So that's another dimension that might affect women very differently. So there's many different pieces, but But I think like, if I sort of were to look at from a big picture point of view, because a lot of our policies and programs are designed keeping in mind a male farmer, what we might miss is accounting for some of these additional vulnerabilities that women face, given that they are such a big part of that.
That brings me to my second question is, you've talked about pollution, you've talked about heat waves, the weather is changing drastically.
Yeah.
Now, what I see is that, so if there's a heat wave, there's a pollution, you don't go out. There's uncontrolled construction going on at different places, which is adding to obviously pollution.
Yeah.
But there's also shrinking of public spaces happening, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you don't go out.
Yeah.
There's no movement.
Yeah.
Then your chances of getting these non-communicable diseases increases manifold.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're not there going to the park.
Yeah.
There's no place to walk.
Yeah.
There's no place to run, and that is what we are witnessing, is that there's a tremendous rise in obesity among people. Young people are dying because of heart attacks.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I don't know whether there are any studies which also talk about it.
Yeah.
And specifically, how are younger people and women being affected by it?
No, that's a really good question. So I think that the interesting thing, or alarming thing in some ways about India and sort of like where we are in the demographic transition as well, is that we still have a population that's undernourished, right? The stunting is still a problem. I think sort of the latest NFHS numbers show that between the 4th and 5th round, stunting reduced from about 38% to 35%, which is still like more than a third of children are stunted.
Yes.
At the same time, like you said, increasingly we are within certain demographics in the country or in certain parts of the country leading more sedentary lives. Whether it's because of climate or whether it's because of the nature of the jobs that are coming into the economy. We don't exercise. We're not sort of going out. Our diets might be not exactly the healthiest or most sort of nutrition forward, but calorie dense. And so you see an increasing rise in obesity. And related to that, I think, in fact, in India, there's some studies that have been done which show that for the same sort of income levels, the prevalence of diabetes and other sorts of NCDs is much higher, right? So you're seeing diabetes, you're seeing hypertension come up. So partly, I suppose it is the sedentary life. There's also some sort of genetic factors at play which perhaps make the Indian population more prone to contracting some of these diseases. So I think in terms of solutions, from whatever we've studied, there are two sort of planks here, right, that we would want to focus on. One is the lifestyle change. So how can you either encourage people to move more, exercise more. So there's actually an interesting study that was done in Tamil Nadu, which we did in partnership with the government, where we provided Fitbits to people who were pre-diabetic or pre-diabetic. And then provided, it was a randomized trial. So some people just got the Fitbit and other people got the Fitbit, plus some incentives for walking 10,000 steps a day. And what we found in that study was that one is that the incentives worked. People who were provided these monetary incentives walked more for, I think it was a 12-week long study, and they walked more during those 12 weeks. But even after the incentives were discontinued, they continued that habit, right? So it's a little bit of habit formation as well, right? Once you give that initial push, then that habit gets formed and people can continue. On the other hand, apart from sort of the lifestyle changes and habit formation, there's the other side of it, which is like, how does the health system come in, right? So, of course, there will, despite all of these efforts, there will be people who have these diseases, but how can you better screen and identify people earlier on in the development of these diseases? Because, identifying diabetes very late or hypertension very late can lead to catastrophic illnesses. And so this is something that we don't necessarily have a solution or a study we've done, but I think sort of figuring out ways and low-cost ways in which you can get people to do more primary healthcare visits, identify the signs of these diseases earlier, so that the treatment can kick in at the right time.
Or maybe also train the primary healthcare providers in identifying these issues, because in general, like something like obesity or hypertension is not recognized that widely as a disease altogether.
Yes, yes.
Right. So, that would bring me to my next question. I mean, do you see any such policy action taking place in South Asia, as per se, where the governments are taking these kind of issues seriously and are taking concrete steps in that direction?
I think they are, right? So I think in 4-5 years ago, the government sort of made this move from the primary health centers to this idea of health and wellness centers. And one big part of this shift was really to integrate primary healthcare for non-communicable diseases into the general healthcare infrastructure. So the whole idea of that, of course, there's like some upgradation that's more in terms of technology, but the government has actually integrated screening for diabetes or screening for hypertension into the training of frontline healthcare workers. There are states, for instance, I think in Andhra Pradesh, they had started this pilot of mobile vans, which would go once a week to every village. The healthcare workers would inform people there about sort of the symptoms related to some of these non-communicable diseases. They would also then sort of screen patients for some of these problems. And so states are trying to do this. This is not a project that we've evaluated, but there's clearly like a recognition that there needs to be something done here. I think like the push that we could make further is trying to see, right, how do you test whether the program is actually working or not.
Let me come back to JPAL's work now. So, I mean, what are the things, can you just mention a few things that JPAL is doing in collaboration with different governments in order to, say, give a sustainable policy for an issue like pollution or an issue regarding health and welfare of women?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and actually it's one of the sort of biggest what we call scale-up projects that we are supporting. We've actually been working in the state of Gujarat with the Gujarat Pollution Control Board for I think a decade and a half or more now. It started with an evaluation that was done many years ago on a third-party audit program. Where essentially what used to happen is that you had sort of the audit system for factories was such that they were contracting the external auditor themselves. And so there was a bit of collusion happening between the auditors and the factories, and you would find that the reporting on the particulate matter emissions from the factories were always just below the permissible limit, right? Which is slightly surprising, like why should the data be concentrated so close to the permissible limit? There was some collusion happening. And so we came, researchers from our network, including Esther Duflo, Michael Greenstone, Rohini Pandey, who work with us, they tested a program where you sort of pooled resources for the audits, and the auditors were sort of engaged by a third party, by the government, rather than by the factories themselves. And so that led to a change in sort of how the data was being reported. But that's an older study. What's happened since then is that continuing that collaboration with the GPCB, Michael Greenstone again, who's also heads the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago, he and his co-authors, Rohini Pandey, Anand Sudarshan, and Nick Ryan, they're all researchers from our network, they tested an emissions trading scheme. So this is essentially a cap and trade scheme where at the market level, so this original evaluation happened in Surat, so there's a market cap that's created for particulate matter emissions. And particulate matter is, what we hear about in the AQI, it's PM 2.5, PM10. PM 2.5 is actually one of the most harmful pollutants as far as, cardiovascular health is concerned. So they basically set a market cap. And then they allocated permits to factories and they allowed the factories to trade those permits. So essentially what that does is that there's an overall cap in how much industries can pollute. And then for industries who are able to reduce their emissions more, they can sell their additional permits to somebody else. And then what they have to ensure is that nobody goes above they don't pollute above their allocated permits. And this was all enabled through these continuous emissions monitoring devices that were
something
set
similar
up in the
like
factory.
global carbon financing, which we...
This is like a financing model for pollution abatement, which is a cap and trade scheme. So what we found was that as a result of the scheme, the particulate matter emissions in these industries went down by about 20 to 30%. Which is a significant job. And actually now, I think this study took a lot of time to sort of incubate, start, designing the market, bringing the industries on board, creating getting them to incorporate the SEMS devices, which is what is allowing us to monitor the emissions data. all of that took many years. But once the study was completed, the government of Gujarat saw the results, and now they're scaling up that program beyond Surat. So it started in Surat, it's been expanded to Ahmedabad. They're looking at 2 additional clusters within Gujarat. There's interest from other state governments in also replicating this model. So there's some initial conversations in Maharashtra. We're now working with the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago to do this work sort of collaboratively with them and taking this forward. So it's a very promising solution, which I think governments are very interested and excited by, because I think one other interesting finding from the study was that pollution reduction did not come at a economic cost to the factories or industries. So that shows you that you can sort of balance, like one of the big sort of issues with environmental regulation or environmental policies is often people pit sort of the market against environmental good.
It's either black or white.
Exactly, and it need not be that way.
Yes,
I think is one of the things that this study shows.
So I mean, this is the environment part. What about health?
So in health, we've actually, one of our earlier studies and sort of the scale up associated with that is a great example. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's this biannual deworming day that's present now in schools everywhere in India. And that happened based on some evaluations that JPAL affiliated researchers had done in Kenya, actually. And then multiple replications in different parts of the world, including one in India. But essentially, what they did was, sort of these soil-based worms is a sort of big health risk for children. Of course, it leads to sort of health outcomes, but also suboptimum health outcomes. But it also leads to children not being able to attend school, learning outcome losses as well. So in this particular study, they provided a deworming pill in the school, which the students had to consume. And what they found is that as a result of this school-based deworming, the students who were attending the school, they had a much lesser likelihood of falling sick due to worm infestation. Their attendance increased, their learning outcomes also increased. But I think more interestingly, some of these results spilled over into their siblings and neighbors who were not coming to those schools, right? So there was a sort of a herd effect almost, right? So once you kind of control the worms infestation and they didn't spread further, other people benefited from this policy. So this is a very old evaluation. But based on that, around 2010, we sort of brought together various government officials, advocated for the use of deworming pills in schools, and it kind of led to the incubation of this organization called Deworm the World, which is now Evidence Action. And they sort of now are taking this work forward in terms of continuing this biannual deworming day. And it's a pretty low-touch, low-cost interventions. Is actually, I think, from all the work that we've done, one of the most cost-effective ways to improve learning and school attendance. And so that's another example of something in health, but coming from education and schools in an interesting way.
Since a lot of your work is also focused on research, primary research and ground-based research, how difficult is it to integrate it with the policy makers? Because I mean, one hand you're going on the ground, you're getting first-hand information.
Yeah.
But then you have to convince somebody sitting in Delhi to ensure that that gets implemented.
So, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think, I would say, for the initial few years at JPAL, we did a lot of our work with NGOs, grassroots organizations. And at some point, we realized that if we want these things to translate into impact, we need to bring the government along from the beginning. So, I would say, it's been a long journey. But we've been working with several state governments for the last, I think now 10 years in Tamil Nadu, Punjab, Odisha, Gujarat is another example I already shared. And what we found is that sort of by building some of these relationships and interacting with the government officials, there's actually quite a lot of demand and interest in using data, using evidence. Oftentimes, I think the struggle is, how quickly can we actually deploy and make this happen? Because the government also wants these results and information fairly quickly. And sometimes we struggle with sort of matching those timelines. But I would say there's definitely a lot of willingness to engage on research and evidence. And more, when governments are funding or sort of the finance department is allocating money for a particular screening program, they are asking other departments, but show us what the outcomes are, right? So I think there's definitely a demand. I think it's figuring out how best you can service it.
So, do we have say support on the ground for such initiatives? Because see, I mean, like the Pulse Polio campaign took a long time to materialize and finally get India free of polio.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do we tackle those kind of issues? Because if you want to do a policy change at the ground level, first we need to start with the training and then expand it, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is all a long game, right? So I think what I was telling you about the emissions trading scheme, the reason I mentioned sort of how long it took to kind of just do the evaluation itself, figuring out the market. All of these things actually do take a lot of time, especially sort of these carefully designed randomized evaluations. It's not possible to deploy them within like 2 months, 3 months. It's just not feasible. And so I think one of the things that happens naturally from the way that we work and the partners we collaborate with, they also come to realize that this is something that requires investment and time.
Right.
And even figuring out implementation, right? So you don't want to test a program through an RCT when the implementation modalities or like the core of the program is still unsettled, right? You're still sort of piloting, and that's what we often do actually is we don't immediately jump into an RCT. We first do some amount of scoping work. We might identify a few programs that we want to test and do piloting first to see, and do it at a much smaller scale to see could this work, and then expand it further into an RCT and then scale up. And some of these programs to scale up have taken 10 years, 15 years even, right? So it is not something that happens overnight for sure. And sometimes that can be a hurdle in terms of making things happen because, the timelines are much faster. But in some of these cases where, we've sort of stuck it out and our partners have stuck it out, we've also seen results.
There can be two approaches to it. One, you set up a short-term goal, and one, you set up a long-term goal.
Yeah.
So, I mean, can you just detail out what should be priorities for the government right now in vis-a-vis, say, okay, this is a short-term benefit that we want to achieve, but then what is sustainable in long term?
And it's hard for me to advise the government on something.
No, but I mean, as
so
such, I mean, somebody like a policy maker or somebody who's working on the ground on policies and is recommending government on these kind of things.
Yeah. So, I mean, for instance, right, like, I think I'll shift away from the climate and health examples because I think education is one which really lends itself to this short and long-term comparison in some ways. So, if you are trying to sort of see results in learning outcomes and improvement there, we've seen actually some programs show changes in children's ability to read and speak words or understand numbers in as short a timeline as 40 to 60 days. So, some of those programs and results, those could be shorter term goals, right? Immediate improvements in learning outcomes at the grade level. You can help students catch up fairly quickly. But for instance, if you want to know, like, does investing into education here lead to, better choices in terms of college? Or if changing attitudes of boys and girls regarding gender lead to different sorts of decisions when they're adults, when they have their own children, or when they opt for the labor market, or when they are studying. That's a much longer ball game, right? So, not to say that one should prioritize one over the other. They are both worthy sort of problems to solve and trying to answer for. But then you need that time horizon for those to manifest, right? So maybe the sort of grade level math and English or Hindi outcomes you could focus on in a much shorter timeline. But some of these other questions it will take longer to answer or find solutions for.
Do you think it's important now that the awareness or say curriculum regarding environment, climate and health be integrated now into, say, school education?
I mean, it potentially could be a good channel. So I think the good thing about schools and, the deworming study is an example of that, is that from that age of about 6 to 18, you have a huge population in a sort of environment where the government has also like a channel of delivery, right? So delivering health interventions to schools is actually a very effective solution. That's something we've seen across a few different studies and something we recommend that governments do. We haven't really tested, how curriculums around environment could also lead to this, but it's a potentially good idea to test out because it is true that one is that, that's the age in which people's mindsets, behaviors can be shaped. But also, like I said, right, the scale that it offers you in terms of reaching people through schools is unmatched elsewhere. Maybe television, maybe some interesting programs or YouTube videos
Or
now.
maybe reels.
Reels, yes, of course, in the current environment. Maybe that could be the other channel, but I think schools still remain like one channel through which so many people can be reached.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think personally, if you simplify these messages and
Yeah.
make it easily accessible for people, that could be the first step because the information is
Yeah.
already there.
Absolutely.
Right.
I think simplifying it and then also making it actionable for people, right?
Right.
You know, it's one thing to sort of just share the information that, you know, like for instance, like this is the problem with plastics and what kind of issues they can lead to in terms of the environment. But
Or
then
what
okay,
kind
should
of
you
food to
do
eat?
now? Oh yeah, what kind of food to eat, right? But then so I think on the food to eat, it's also a little bit more complicated because you need to have the resources to access the right kind of food. And in some cases, it's possible that people already have the resources, but in others, it might not be. But yes, I think simplifying the message, making it actionable.
So something as basic as the biscuit that you are buying of
Yeah.
which costs 5 rupees. I mean, is it good enough for you?
Yeah.
I mean, how much sugar it has?
Exactly. So I think getting people to understand like the harmful effects of sugar and then saying that, okay, this biscuit has so much sugar, you can sort of fill your stomach up with something else which also has fiber, has other micro and macronutrients. Like, why not have that instead, right? So giving people another option in that information messaging might also be sort of a good way to do that rather than saying, just don't have the biscuit.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Urvashi, for giving us your time. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. It was great speaking to you as well.
Thank you for watching us. That was Urvashi Vattal, Associate Director Policy at JPAL South Asia. To watch more such insightful conversations, go to our channel, subscribe our YouTube. Thank you.